So, as Mary said, this morning, I'm going to talk about Dublin's Victorian heritage. Queen Victoria reigned from 1837 to 1901, and my view is that this era in Dublin has not received its due attention. It has been overshadowed by the understandable attention paid to the wonderful Georgian era in Dublin. But when you think about it, we're very privileged to inherit a legacy of Victorian buildings still in place. Many people live or work in a Victorian house or office, and the chances are you may worship God in a Victorian church and that you may worship Mammon in a Victorian bank. The infrastructure all around us, a good deal of it was built in Victorian times. There's water supply, drainage, bridges, railways, etc. So those 64 years of Victoria's reign span the formative years in which the foundations of modern Dublin were created. And this morning I hope to give you a flavour of what remains of the Victorian era in Dublin. You probably have seen most of it, but you probably haven't put it all together. But I'm going to give it historical context. It, of course, there's a huge range, so I have to gallop through it very quickly, so you'll have to bear with me on that. And I'm using the photographs from a book on Victorian Dublin Revealed. Some of these photographs are unique, as I was very privileged to be allowed in to see places where the public can't go. And in addition to that, I had an early start on the book, and during the early 1980s I took some black and white photographs of places which now are either disappeared or are radically altered. So this is what the city looked like in 1834, and as you can see, it's quite compact, and the city was contained by the canals. But during the Victorian period itself, as the city grew, the first growth was to the south as the suburbs grew. Now, the development in Dublin over that period was quite different in comparison to other 19th century cities, certainly in these islands. Dublin was at the centre of a very peculiar mix of politics and religion that seethed in Ireland at that time. One of the most important ones was the rise of post-emancipation Catholicism, which together with nationalism was on the increase. And in tandem with this, and perhaps as a result of this, the middle classes began to flee from the central city to the new suburbs. And this is against the decline of the parts of the central city, the central Georgian city. As we will see, industrial Dublin did not grow, but the city did develop as a financial and administrative centre. And now I'm going to talk about some institutions, because art, culture and science were served by several imposing institutions with their buildings, which were established during the 19th century. And during the time of industrial progress, there was a sense of change, and in the Victorian era, learned men and women sought to advance the boundaries of science and knowledge. And one of these institutions which did this was the zoological gardens in the Phoenix Park. So this opened in the dawn of the Victorian age, and it was scientific and educational, but it also afforded the Dublin populace the chance to see exotic creatures, many of which were within the bounds of the British Empire, which at that time covered, of course, practically the whole globe. And this building here is quite interesting. It's the Houghton House of 1898. It's since it was built, it's been very extensively reconstructed. But it's named after Samuel Houghton, who was the secretary of the Zoological Society in the 1860s. He was an exceptional man. He was a clergyman. He was a polymath in all kinds of sciences, and as well, he constructed a unique set of tables which became known as Houghton's drop. This allowed a hangman to refer to this table when he was trying to calculate the correct drop for a condemned prisoner to ensure a humane death. Dunsink Observatory is the oldest scientific institution in Ireland, and William Rowan Hamilton was the astronomer there during the first part of the 19th century, and you probably know that while walking by Broome Bridge in 1843, he was inspired to discover the mathematical theory of quaternions. And this is Dunsink, and in the foreground is the observatory building. It houses the South 12-inch telescope of 1868, and I'll be talking a little bit more about this later on. Another institution which pushed the bounds of agronomy, I suppose, or botany, was the Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin. And this is the great curvilinear range building which was constructed by the Dublin ironmaster Richard Turner in the period 1845 to 1869. Turner had developed great expertise in long-span buildings, and he used the materials of the new industrial revolution, that's iron and glass. He also constructed a similar palm house in Belfast, and his crowning achievement, of course, is the great palm house at Kew Gardens in London. It was the age of the railways as well. We'll be talking about some of the railway developments in Dublin later on. But in 1853, the wealthy contractor William Dorgan, is also known as the father of the Irish Railways, organised the great exhibition in Leinster Lawn, and he was the driving force behind the setting up of the National Gallery, which was completed in 1864. And here you see a view. It's of the end of the Victorian era, really, the Milltown wing, which was added starting from 1900, again designed by Thomas Manley Dean. We're going to hear a lot about the Dean family. And if you look at this, you'll note the fine wood carvings of one Carlo Cambi up above. And Cambi was from Siena, and he's quite ubiquitous in Dublin. He did the carvings in the National Library, the National Museum, and also, interestingly, in Rathmines Town Hall. If you walk by Leinster House, at the side of it, on the Marion Square side, you'll notice the Natural History Museum. It's very restrained in its external style. However, within, it has a rich and wonderful Victorian interior. It contains an exhilarating confection of stuffed animals, trays of preserved specimens, and all contained within mahogany cabinets. It's true Victorian. So it's also, of course, as you probably know, known as true Victorian institution. It's also known as, affectionately, as the Dead Zoo. It opened in 1857, and David Livingstone gave the inaugural lecture here. Later Victorian additions in the same area are the National Library and the National Museum, located at either side of the Leinster House. And this is the great reading room of the National Library in all its Victorian splendour. And it was completed in 1890 to a design by the Deans, Thomas Newnham Dean and Thomas Manley Dean, son and grandson, respectively, of Sir Thomas Dean, who earlier had designed the museum building in Trinity College and the Kildare Street Club. And we're going to hear a lot about the Dean family. Now, when you go to the National Museum in Kildare Street, there are wonderful exhibits all around, and I'm sure you will be most absorbed, but I would suggest it's worth lifting one's gaze from these exhibits and look at the glorious cast iron roof, highly decorated. It was completed in 1890, and the building was designed by the Deans. In the mid-19th century, there was a lot of development and innovation in medicine in Dublin. And physicians there were at the forefront of new discoveries. And on the left-hand side, you see stained glass at the Royal College of Physicians building in Kildare Street, which has a wonderful Victorian interior. And also at the Royal College is the statue of Sir Dominic Corrigan, who died in 1880. He had been appointed physician to Queen Victoria in Ireland, but he made several important medical discoveries. There were effects of the Catholic emancipation on the medical world in Dublin, because after Catholic emancipation, Catholic hospitals were able to be established in Dublin. As well as providing services, they also facilitated access to the medical profession for the emergent Catholic middle classes. There was St. Vincent's Hospital, and here we see the Mater Hospital in Eccles Street, which was set up by the Sisters of Mercy in 1861. There has always been a big presence, understandably for many reasons, of the British military in Ireland. And by the time of the Victoria's accession, the Irish proportion of the British Army, or the amount of what was then Irishmen in the British Army, was huge. It amounted to around 40% at that time. It did decline over the rest of the century because of the decline of the Irish population and the famine and so on. But by the last quarter of the 19th century, there were around 25,000 troops stationed in Ireland. And Dublin, of course, was at the hub of military Ireland, and up to half of the Irish garrison was stationed there, and there were around 8 barracks where the soldiers were based. And a very impressive barrack is Marlborough Barracks. It's now McKee, it's on Black Horse Avenue. It's a wonderful late Victorian construction, still in use by the Defence Forces. The red brick design with turrets and copper cupolas gives echoes of imperial adventure. There is a story about the design being swapped with that for a barracks for India. It's a great story, but alas, it's not true. Again, for more fantasy, if you like, we go to the Freemasons' Hall in Molesworth Street, which dates from 1866. And within this is an array of exotic rooms designed around fantastical themes. And when I first came to this building, I'd never been in there before to take photographs. I was amazed by the splendor. And one example is here you see the mock Gothic of the Prince Mason's chamber room in all its medieval glory. And here is another wonderful room. This is the Grand Chapter Room in the Freemasons' Hall, and the decoration is in line with the Masonic identification with the priestly rites and rituals of Pharaonic Egypt. And if you look here, you'll see the sphinxes at the front and all around on the coving. The coving is based on the flora of the Nile. And not too far away from there, here is Sir Thomas Dean and Benjamin Woodward's Kildare Street Club, which dates from 1861. It's now, half of it is the Alliance Francaise and the other part belongs to the National Library. So here you see the Italianate style is blended with Byzantine, and all around there's wonderful carved stone detailing by the partnership's ensemble of stone carvers who included the famous O'Shea brothers. And just across from there, across College Park in Trinity College, is Dean and Woodward's masterpiece, the museum building. I'll talk a little bit about that later. And the partnership also designed the Oxford Museum of Natural History. For this, they also brought along the same stone carvers, the O'Shea brothers. And speaking of stone carving, all around the building are, I'm sure you've seen this, myriad of carvings showing a variety of animals. One of my favorites is this one of the monkeys playing billiards, and I always wonder, was it a comment by the stone carvers on the rich and leisured members of the Kildare Street Club? The Wellington Testimonial Monument in the Phoenix Park is quite impressive. It started before the Victorian era, when the great and the good of Dublin contributed to the building of this in 1817, but it took a long time, and it was only completed in 1861. It commemorates Arthur Wellesley, Dubliner and first Duke of Wellington, and it is reputed to be the highest obelisk in Europe. And the bronze friezes around the side are from cannons melted down, which were captured at Waterloo. And now I'm going to show you what is my favorite statue in Dublin. This is one of Prince Albert, Victoria's Concert by John Henry Foley. It dates from 1871. Foley, of course, did the great statue of O'Connell down on O'Connell Street. This statue is at the south end of Leinster Lawn. It's tucked away in hedging, very discreet, and you can just about see it through the railings when you enter the natural, at the right side of the entrance of the Natural History Museum. The plaster model for the statue was blown up, but surprisingly the statue itself has survived the perilous outcomes that affect royal statuary in Dublin. Albert, who died in 1861, was a firm believer in the Victorian virtues of improvement and progress, and this is reflected in the 4 earnest figures of young men that surround the statue, and they represent art, manufacturing, agriculture, and science. Now I'm going to talk about the suburbs of Dublin, the growth area during the Victorian era. As the century progressed, as I previously mentioned, the middle classes migrated from the central city to the growing townships such as Rathmines and Pembroke. In these locations, was a kind of a Celtic tiger property boom, I guess. Speculative builders constructed suitable residences, and in several instances they actually controlled the township councils. Lower rates added to the contentment of the affluent who lived in their elegant villas and terraces. However, as public transport improved, the clerical and lower middle classes also began to live in the outer areas of the townships. And as the townships grew, the central city, the old Georgian city, went into somewhat of a decline. Over the span of the Victorian era, the city population had grown by only 25% to 290,000 people, while the population for the suburbs, by contrast, had tripled to over 90,000. Now, Rathmines and Township were the principal townships, and the largest of these Rathmines came about as development extended southwards beyond the Grand Canal. And I show here the most iconic symbol of all the townships. This is the clock tower of the Rathmines Town Hall, constructed in red brick and Dumfries red sandstone. The building, which opened in 1897, replaced the earlier town hall. And it's so vertical because it had to fit on a small footprint, the floor area of a former house. The railway had an impact. The seaside resorts of Kingstown, which is now Dún Laoghaire, Dalkey and Killiney grew during the Victorian era thanks to the building of the railway from Dublin along the coast to the south. Just to illustrate, here a train emerges from Dalkey Tunnel, Victorian Tunnel, with Sorrento Terrace to the right, and you see the wonderful multi-storied Victorian stucco on Sorrento Terrace of these buildings looking out over Killiney Bay. Now, I'm looking forward to the next talk after this morning on Dublin's bourgeois homes, but just here's a quick taster. And this is George Bernard Shaw's family home in Sing Street. I was lucky to get in there, but I understand it's now closed to the public. But it's early Victorian, it's a terraced house in classical style. But it gives you the feel of what a Victorian house looks like. And on the left is a bedroom, and on the right is the living room with the typical Victorian cluttered look. And there was a lot of work on infrastructure during the Victorian times, and a huge advance for public health, and it reduced mortality enormously, was the Dublin Corporation's voluntary water scheme. It was completed in 1871, and it brought a secure water supply to Dublin. Am I right in thinking that the approval for this huge scheme would have, the final approval would have been given right in this room? I guess so. So, Victorian engineers did not just build in a functional style. They always added decoration, as you can see by this intake tower and access bridge at Vartry Reservoir, which is near Roundwood, County Wicklow, part of the scheme. And the Vartry scheme involved cost an enormous amount of money, but it did bring the first secure potable water supply to Dublin. It involved truly heroic engineering through rugged countryside. It ran from the Vartry Reservoir to Dublin, firstly through a 4-kilometre tunnel, and then carried uphill and down dale with a huge diameter cast iron pipe. It was carried over the rivers by Gothic-style bridges, which you see one of these here. It's the pipe bridge over the Dargle River, which, as I found out when I tried to scramble down the steep bank on the right-hand side here, it is in very inaccessible terrain. And it came to a receiving reservoir in Stillorgan, which is still there. Now, water and drainage was very important, and as it turned out, in the Victorian era, there were water and drainage wars. The Rathmines township, controlled by, if you like, speculative builders and other property interests, was obsessed with keeping costs to a minimum and maintaining independence from the presumed tentacles of Dublin Corporation. And I guess right here in this Dublin Corporation's council chamber was the centre of Rathmines' perceived axis of evil. Up to then, Rathmines Township had been getting its water from the canal. It had been invited to participate in the Vartry water scheme, but it refused. However, the canal water supply was of poor quality. It included much foreign matter, which was the subject of many letters of complaint to the Irish Times, and eventually Rathmines constructed its own reservoir, which is here at Bornabrina and Glenasmole, and water flowed from here to the township in 1888. And the same happened with drainage. And on being contacted by Dublin Corporation suggesting that they work together on a drainage scheme, the Rathmines town council board in the town hall announced, "Rathmines will drain alone." And eventually Rathmines did collaborate with Pembroke Township, and in the late 1870s there was a drainage scheme laid by them down to Dublin Bay. Something a little bit different. Going to talk a little bit about the architectural style and, I suggest, an intriguing link to the past. Some years ago, I did a book on Islamic Spain, and it was launched at the Engineers Ireland premises at Clyde Road, which you see on the door to the right. And if you look above, see the arch above the door, it has a polychrome arch, and I noticed the similarity between it and, if you look at this photograph I had taken from my book, the arches of the Caliphal Palace of Medinat Azara, which is outside Cordoba in Spain. And there is more similarity. If you go to the museum building in Trinity College, it's one of the finest Victorian buildings in Dublin, and it is again by Sir Thomas Dean and Benjamin Woodward. Dates from, it was completed in 1857, and if you look here, see on the right, you have more polychrome arches. And contrast this with, on the left, the great Mosque of Cordoba, with its forest of arches, again in polychrome. So why the similarity? Well, the answer is that with regard to the Victorian buildings, there was a great Victorian enthusiasm for what they called the Venetian style, and it was encouraged by the aesthete John Ruskin, the British aesthete, in his book On the Stones of Venice. Venetian architecture in turn had been influenced by that of Byzantium, which included the use of polychrome arches, and then in turn in Al-Andalus and the Islamic Middle East, they were also influenced by the architectural techniques of ancient Rome and its successor Byzantium. So there's the similarity. It derived from ancient times, but came to Spain and the Middle East and to Dublin by vastly different routes. And just a final word on similarity. If you look here at the picture on the right, the two domes which crown the magnificent entrance hall of the museum building in Trinity. See the two Byzantine-style domes, and if you apply a little bit of imagination, you can see some similarity with what was originally the Cathedral of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Byzantine Constantinople, is now Istanbul. So we have some interesting echoes in architectural styles in this city. So I'm now going to move from buildings, architecture, I suppose, to first of all think about the Victorian soul. So Catholic emancipation in 1829 ended the remaining formal restrictions on Catholics. And this, I suppose you could say, there was an emergence of Catholic power, rising Catholic power, and this was made manifest in a physical way on the streets of Dublin. As the repression of the penal times fell away, the Catholic Church now was able to start building. It began building con allegro. It was no longer the church of the side streets. And the pace of church building increased, and the new churches of that era were prominent both in location as well as employing an assertive style of architecture. I'm just going to give a few examples. And I'm sure you all have seen this. This is Patrick Byrne's St. Paul's Church on Iron Quay. It was completed in 1844. The architectural historian Christine Casey called this an example of heroic post-emancipation classicism. And now we look on High Street, and this is the modern St. Audun's Church, again classical and in a very prominent position, and it's also by Patrick Byrne, and it dates from 1846. And by the middle of the 19th century, the architectural world was a ferment of competing theories on what was the appropriate architectural style to apply. And the intense Catholic convert, he was located in Britain, A.W. Pugin, who died in 1852, he declared that all classical architecture was false, and he argued forcefully for the verticality of the Gothic style, with its, what he thought were genuine roots back to the Middle Ages. And he carried out designs of many Catholic churches in Britain and several commissions in Ireland. And I was lucky to have a tour of the Palace of Westminster last week in London, and the building built of the Houses of Commons and Lords by Charles Barry, built in the mid-19th century, but he did it in collaboration with Pugin, and Pugin's stamp is everywhere. He designed this Gothic style down to everything, down to Gothic style brass doorknobs. So this church here, the Augustinian Church of Saints Augustine and John, it dominates Thomas Street. Construction began in 1862, and it took 33 years to complete, and it demonstrates the verticality of Pugin's Gothic style. It actually was designed by his son, and the great aesthete John Ruskin said on viewing the plans for this church that it would be a poem in stone. However, when we go around Dublin now and see all the classical style churches and the Gothic style churches, I find that in Dublin, just on St. Stephen's Green, that there's a Byzantine jewel in the heart of the city which makes a refreshing change. And this is the University Church on St. Stephen's Green, which was established by John Henry Newman, and it opened in 1856 to a design by John Hungerford Pollen. And the interior has references to the Roman Church of St. Paolo fuori le mura. The great architectural historian Maurice Craig, in his book on Dublin, called it a delightful building, emphatically revival rather than survival. Now we have to remember, of course, that during the Victorian era there was a Dublin. These islands were all in the middle and maybe at the heart of the British Empire. And the Dublin middle classes aspired to the values of Victorian Britain, and they engaged enthusiastically with the British Empire, and they provided soldiers and civil servants for this. And this is illustrated poignantly in places such as St. Patrick's Cathedral, which is full of monuments to young Irishmen who joined the British forces and fought and died in the wars of imperial conquest. Here's a wonderful memorial in marble to the fallen of the Royal Irish Regiment. This was during the China War, which ended in 1842. And Lieutenant Colonel Tomlinson expires heroically at the Battle of Chapu. And the conflict was known as the Opium War, and Britain won and gained concessions, including the territory of Hong Kong. And here's another one, also in St. Patrick's, again to the fallen of the Royal Irish Regiment. This is from the Burma War, 1853. It's a scene from the storming of the Shu Dagon Pagoda in Rangoon. And the British won the war and they gained Lower Burma. In Victorian Dublin, just because you were dead didn't mean you could escape the sectarian divide. As the 19th century progressed, it evolved that primarily Catholics were buried in Glasnevin Cemetery, and it was to be mainly Protestants buried at Mount Jerome Cemetery. So Glasnevin was founded through the efforts of Daniel O'Connell. I'm not sure, is there a portrait of O'Connell in this room? Is he? There he is, that's the man. Yes, of course. And so another monument to him is the big tower in Glasnevin, which you see here to the left. And on the right is the crypt of his tomb, and within here is the coffin of O'Connell, and it's all in, I suppose, with shamrocks and ornamentation, sort of Victorian idea of Irish decoration. And this is one of the castellated watchtowers erected on the perimeter of Glasnevin Cemetery. These served as lookouts for armed night watchmen in their struggle against the resurrectionists, or grave robbers, who plagued the cemetery during its early years. And if you move to the south of the city, Mount Jerome presents a wonderful Victorian funerary style. And here are the mausolea, vaults and statuary. They're large, they're of some substance, for here was buried the haute bourgeoisie of Dublin, who probably lived in grand residences, but then they would spend the rest of eternity in grand mausoleum. There's some interesting graves or monuments in Mount Jerome. This is the Harvey Memorial. The faithful dog is howling above his master's cloak. His master was drowning, and standing on the cloak, the dog barked to call for help. And later, when the dog died, it was interred here with its master. Another interesting tomb is the Gresham tomb in Mount Jerome. In an interesting semi-pyramidical shape, I guess. The lady interred here had a dread of being buried alive, so there was a bell placed on top of the tomb, linked by a chain down into the coffin. This would have allowed her, in the happy event that she woke up, to call attention. In addition to that, the coffin itself had special spring-loaded locks, allowing quick release from within, so everything was covered here. So now we go to more economic or industrial matters. And as I had mentioned, Dublin's economy did not perform well relative to that of the developing industrial cities of Britain, the Birminghams and the Manchesters, and neither with the stellar industrial growth of Belfast. Belfast really by the end of the Victorian era had outshone Dublin. However, the rapid expansion of railways as well as the growth of steam-powered shipping radically changed the dynamics of Dublin trade. British goods could now be transported efficiently and cheaply to all parts of Ireland, and local manufacturers found it difficult to compete with British mass-produced products. But there was one exception in Dublin, and this was brewing. Brewing was the success story of industrial Dublin in the 19th century. At the beginning of that century, there were over 50 breweries, but Guinness's soon became the largest brewery in the city. It kept on investing in machinery and continually improved productivity, and its markets expanded and it exported. And by the end of the Victorian era, the Guinness brewery complex extended to over 50 acres, and it was then the largest brewery in the world. And this is a scene from the 1980s where you see the ranks of oak vats and vat house 4. These are used for maturation of the stout before it was racked into casks for distribution. Another Victorian view, and this is the tops of the barley storage bins in the Robert Street Malt House, which was built in the mid-1880s. So the Guinness family, of course, became fabulously wealthy, and they were able to set up large estates in the Dublin area, but there were generous benefactors as well, and they lavished funds in Victorian Dublin on civic works, workers' housing, reconstruction of St. Patrick's Cathedral, and also St. Stephen's Green. And in 1835, Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness established a large estate at St. Anne's in Raheny. It's now a public park. The mansion, the house they had, was remodeled in the 1870s, and this tower, which was on the roof, was moved to a lake. It's said to be based on the cenotaph of the Julie, which dates from Roman Gaul, which was found at Saint-Remy in France. Interesting tower. I've heard since I took this photograph many years ago, the tower has been cleaned of graffiti and is now in a splendid position over the lake in St. Anne's. Another Guinness estate is that at Farmley, near the Finney's Park, which was purchased in 1873 by Sir Benjamin's son, who became Lord Ivy. And this You see here the Italianate clock tower, which dates from 1880. It houses a water tank from the water which carried across what's known as the Guinness Bridge over the Liffey. Turbines, water turbines pumped it up to this water tank, and the large diameter clock was made by Grubbs, the instrument and telescope makers of Rathmines, of whom a little bit more later on. Ivy House on the south side of St. Stephen's Green. It was purchased by Sir Benjamin Lee Guinness. It was a Georgian house when he purchased it in 1856, but he remodeled it extensively in the Victorian style, and it's now the headquarters of the Department of Foreign Affairs. And this here is the enormous late Victorian ballroom there. It's airy and grand, and apparently the social gatherings here were so great that they eclipsed those held by the Lord Lieutenant in nearby Dublin Castle. We had a look at Dunsink Observatory, and here is the South Telescope. It was erected there in 1868, and the telescope is still in working order. The lens came from Paris, but it was set in a telescope mounting, and the whole enclosure, of course, was built by the Grubb Optical and Mechanical Works in Rathmines. Now, Rathmines is not a place generally known as an industrial heartland. However, large sophisticated telescopes were manufactured here. They actually ground the glass lenses, and they were exported by Grubbs to observatories all over the world. In 1875, the firm secured a contract to supply a 27-inch refracting telescope for Vienna, and it was then the largest refracting telescope in the world. The firm later on began to make periscopes for submarines, and after the 1916 rebellion, the British Admiralty insisted that Grubbs move production from Ireland to Britain because of security concerns. Now, if you want to see wonderful red brick, I suggest you take a stroll up to the City Fruit and Vegetable Market at Mary's Lane. All around is a wonderful symphony of red brick polychromy. And it was built for Dublin Corporation, designed by the city engineer, Park Neville, and completed in 1892. And if you want to get some idea of what the Victorian diet was like, you can walk around the perimeter wall of this city market, because all around there's a wonderful extravaganza of terracotta detail of foods, and here on the left you see fish, and on the right rhubarb. But as you all know, there's more to life than just food. There is drink. So Victorian Dublin saw growth in the number of public houses and groceries, and many of these were set up by Catholic migrants from the country, usually financed by the capital of their farms. There are many fine examples of Victorian public houses around the city which have thankfully not been refurbished with modern leather and brass and so on. So here you see Doheny and Nesbitt's in Bagot Street, said to be founded in 1850, and it has the traditional wooden partitions, the mirrors, and the snug. Here's another one. This is the Long Hall in South Great George's Street. It still has a wonderful Victorian interior. And Dublin became the financial and commercial centre of Ireland during the 19th century, and it was centred around here, around Dame Street and College Streets. And down the street, if you wander, you can savour the architectural blend of fantasy and medievalism of the banks and insurance companies. And here are a few examples. This is the Ulster Bank down near Trinity College. If I remember, this is the former National Irish Bank. It's now a clothing company. And this is just down the way here. This is now the AIB Bank. Just a little bit more on that one. It was designed by Thomas Newen and Dean. It was originally the Munster Bank, but he brought, if you look at it closely, you'll see echoes of Lombardy in this palazzo-style building. And it dates from 1873. And on the right, you can see an example of the wonderful, rich stucco decoration inside. Still on Dame Street, I'm not sure if it's, I don't think it's actually open to the public now, but here's Victorian banking at its grandest. This is the decorated cast iron columns and the barrel vaulted ceiling. It was the banking hall of the former Royal Bank, latterly AIB, and when last heard it was owned by Trinity College. It's in Foster Place and it dates from 1860. At the dawn of the 19th century, Dublin was a small, intimate city, and you could really walk to most parts of the city. And as it and its suburbs expanded, the modes of transport became more sophisticated. The horse tram network developed, and Dublin became a transport hub. As the railways, it was the age of the railways, and Dublin was connected to most towns and cities in Ireland by 1865. So these good connections and the rise of the steamship contributed to the expansion of Dublin port. It all started with the construction of the North Bull Wall in the early 19th century. The resulting surge of water improved the depth of channel available to shipping. Another development was that in 1815 the first steamship had sailed into the port, and as the city progressed, the throughput of the port, aided by the great railway connections both in Britain and in Ireland, the throughput expanded. There was a need for big extension to the port, which was carried out in 1871, and the Dublin port engineer, who had the wonderful name of Bindon Blood Stoney, he devised an innovative way of using 300-ton blocks of concrete to build the quay walls, instead of the older ways of building cofferdams and then constructing these within the cofferdam. These concrete blocks were lifted in place by a floating steam crane, and this diving bell was used to allow workmen to access, to come down this chamber here into the chamber on the bottom and work on the seabed to prepare it for placing the concrete blocks. Incidentally, this is now a visitor centre down on the quays, which is quite interesting. Now I'm going to move to what for me is a rather sad story, and I'll show you a photograph I took in the 1980s of the graceful stepped and curving lines of the graving dock at the North Wall port area. This would have allowed ships to either to be maintained or constructed down there. It was constructed in granite by the great contractor William Durgan in 1859, and it was founded on piles of timber which came from Memel in Prussia, which is less exotically now Klaipėda in Lithuania. However, decline set in, and here's a view of the same graving dock in 2009, all weeds and rubbish. but it was filled in 2010, and it's now probably just a park for lorries and containers. But the building, the essential structure, as far as I know, still exists. Maybe one day it'll be dug out again. More nostalgia. Another view from the 1980s. This is the Point Depot as it looked before its conversion to the present entertainment centre. It was a railway freight depot with sidings, and it was equipped with small cranes, and it was constructed in 1878 to cater for sundry goods from the nearby port. Dublin was an innovator in railways. The first railway in Dublin opened at the dawn of the Victorian age. This was in December 1834. The Dublin to Kingstown, which is now Dún Laoghaire, railway was the first suburban railway in the world. And Westland Road that you see here was the terminus of this, Dublin's first railway station. And the station was altered in 1891 when the overhead loop line connection, this bridge continuing on, the loop line connection to Amiens Street Station was opened. It was almost a railway mania, and construction of railways continued. In 1844, the first train went north. The Dublin and Drogheda Railway carried the Lord Lieutenant and over 500 passengers to Drogheda. And 2 months later, the same Lord laid the foundation stone for the new terminus here at Amiens Street, now Connolly Station. There had always been a dream for a railway connecting the first terminus, this was at Westland Row, which would run directly through the city to a terminus for the west at what was then Kingsbridge. But this dream has never been fulfilled. This is a drawing from 1837. It shows an cast iron colonnade carrying an elevated railway which would run on high along the Liffey Quays. Never was built, it was too expensive. Who knows if and when the planned underground Dart interconnector is built, this dream might be achieved. The Great Southern and Western Railway made the connection from Dublin to Cork in 1849. It built its headquarters and station at Kingsbridge, which is now Heuston Station. And the building was finally finished in 1848, and it was designed by the English architect Sancton Wood. Decoration includes Corinthian pillars and balustrades, but I think if you look at these cupolas, and there's another one on the other side of the building, I think there's a hint of India there. And the Great Southern and Western Railway Works in Inchicore were established in 1845, and they were a self-contained world. It was the most advanced technology, most advanced engineering location in Ireland. Here was everything you needed to maintain and construct locomotives and rolling stock. So Sancton Wood included the tower here in his design for what is now the former running shed at the Inchicore Works. The tower initially provided a point for the signal or lookout men. You probably see it's right next to the main line, and you will see this as you travel down south from Heuston. The west was served by the Middle and Great Western Railway terminus at Broadstone. The building was completed in 1850 to a design by John Skipton Mulvaney. It dominates the plateau of open space where once in front of it the Royal Canal Harbour lay. It has an Egyptian theme on the facade, and to my mind it's probably the finest Victorian exterior in Dublin, but up to now it's been largely out of public view in poor surroundings with a petrol station and various buildings around it. Now it has been opened up by the new Lewis works which pass in front of it. I haven't seen the finished plans. I certainly hope they will respect the majesty of this building. The great historian Maurice Craig wrote, "The Broadstone is the last building in Dublin to partake of the sublime. Its lonely grandeur is emphasized now by its disuse as a terminus. It stands on rising ground, and the traveller who sees it for the first time, so unexpected in its massive amplitude, feels a little as he might if he were to stumble unawares upon the monstrous silences of Karnak or Luxor," which I think is a wonderful quotation. The architecture within, of course, is ornate in the usual Victorian style. This is just a view inside the building. And there were more stations. This is the station at Harcourt Street, designed by George Wilkinson. It was opened in 1859. The tracks and platforms were built high above the street as the incoming tracks had to cross the nearby streets and the canal. Thus, by this time, there were 5 railway termini on the perimeter of the Victorian city, which is quite a lot for any city. But there was another one. The London and North Western Railway had operated steamers to Ireland, and they set up in the North Wall in 1877. And here on the left is their station, and from here you could travel all around the country, south, west and north. And on the right hand side is another wonderful building. This is the Railway Hotel. Now, travelling within the city in the early Victorian days, it wasn't comfortable. You could rattle along on a rough road in a horse omnibus with its wooden wheels on the cobbles or gravelled surface. The introduction of the trams meant that there was the smooth ride of a steel wheel on rail, and this was achieved in February 1872 when the first Dublin horse tram ran between College Green and Garville Avenue in Rathgar. The tram network was initially laid in the southern suburbs of the city and catered for a mainly middle-class clientele. Here are just a few photographs. This is the old tram depot in Dalkey, and you see the logo of the Dublin United Tramways Company, which ran the trams in Dublin. In time, the tram network did extend from the lucrative southern routes to the north side, and the system was finally electrified by January 1901. Now I'm going to conclude. So, at the beginning of the 19th century, the city had to endure the shock of losing its parliament, but with the rise of the railway and the steamship, it became the main transport hub of Ireland. However, this brought competition to local industry, and the city slipped from being the second city of the empire at the beginning of the century to a mere 10th place by the century's end. However, it did become this country's administrative, financial and commercial centre. And talking a little bit more about transport, by the end of the Victorian era, it was easy to get across the city on an extensive electric tram network. It was far, far better than today. Now, despite the 2 or nearly 3 excellent but very limited Lewis lines, at many times and increasingly into the future, we're experiencing gridlock across the city. It remains to be seen if in the future, through a renaissance of the tram and other public transport, if we can recapture the Dublin of easy access that ruled 110 years ago. So, and lastly, magnificent institutions, churches and banks of the Victorian era can be seen all over Dublin, and the essential Victorian suburb still adorns the city, both north and south of the Liffey. We're very lucky to live among such wonderful heritage, and I would suggest to you to please go out, explore, have another look, savour it and enjoy it. Thank you very much.